Thanks a lot, Joey. So I work with Joey at WSU Puyallup, and I'm a plant pathologist. So real quick, I want to talk about some invasive plant diseases. And there's, I don't have time to talk about a lot of them, but I'm going to focus on two in this talk. And just this photo that we're looking at here is kind of the aftermath of sudden oak death in California, where it's taken out certain species of oak, which are now decaying in the forest, and those oaks are being replaced by other host trees, such as California bay laurel, that are resistant to the disease. And so that's kind of what happens with some of these plant diseases. They wipe out certain host species and change the forest composition. Okay, so just to cover this real fast, we know that plants get sick just like we do. There's two different ways that you can look at symptoms on plants. There are certain things that cause damage to plants that are not caused by an organism. We call that abiotic. And so there are a list of things here. But the ones that we're most concerned about are the biotic causes of plant disease. Unlike we heard about a fungal disease of animals with the bats, and the bacteria and viruses are more commonly what cause disease in animals. But with plants, it's fungi and a group of organisms that we call water molds or oomycetes that behave very much like fungi, but are a completely different group of organisms. And when we see damage from them, it's generally, on a certain part of the plant, like the roots or, foliage or something. The damage can look patchy as opposed to the entire plant dying. The only difference would be a root disease, where then, that damages the root system, which then causes stress on the entire tree. And then the whole tree can die. So those are a couple differences there. We already saw this, which is really great. I don't have to go into a lot of detail about it. But the thing to think about in managing these plant diseases is, what parts of this disease triangle we can manipulate. And I think the most important one is the pathogen or pest and keeping it out. Prevention is really important. But once it gets in, then you can do things like manipulating the environment or the hosts through breeding. So one of these invasive diseases that you might run across in the forest is white pine blister rust. And this organism is a fungus that came into the US from Europe, from Asia originally, by way of Europe in the early 1900s, and it infects 5-needle pines like white pine, or western white pine, eastern white pine, white bark pine, those pines. The interesting thing about this organism is it needs to have an alternate host to complete its life cycle. So that is most of the time species of ribes or gooseberries that grow nearby. But occasionally a couple of these other herbaceous hosts will support the spore stage of blister rust. And it's very difficult to control because the spores are airborne. So they blow around, they land on a susceptible host. If you have the right timing, then you'll get disease. And the severe disease that we're concerned about is on the pine host, where you see these blistery pustules that contain spores. And so it's really difficult, like I said, to manage something like this. So the best way to do it is planting resistant trees. There's a large breeding program that the Forest Service has in Oregon, where they're working on this, and the Canadians and other folks are studying this and trying to breed resistant white pine and other 5-needle pines. Sometimes in the early stages, before these pustules open, you can prune those out if you see them. That'll slow it down. There was a big effort during the Depression, I think, in the 1930s to, when they had a lot of manpower, to do removal of the alternate host, which, might have slowed it down a little bit, but ultimately was a lot of effort for not much payoff there. And here are some symptoms of white pine blister rust on the pine host. So you'll see branch flagging, and if you look closer at those branches, then you'll see cankering on those branches. That's restricting the water flow and nutrients to the branch so it dies. If it gets on the main stem, it will girdle and kill the whole tree. And if you look closely at some of the older cankers, there'll be resin flow sometimes. Animals, for some reason, like to chew on the edges of these cankers. It might have a lot of, I don't know, something they like in the phloem tissue. And the cankers are generally centered on a branch stub and are diamond shaped. So that's what it looks like. Okay, now I'm going to move on to one of my favorite subjects, which is Phytophthora. This organism is a water mold, so it's a fungus-like organism. It needs water, wet conditions for its life cycle. You can see in this video, some of the swimming zoospores are being released from a structure that we call sporangium. And those spores can swim in soil water or, in a water body, in a film of water on a leaf, and then they can infect the host. So this organism is microscopic and you can't see it without a microscope. We often just can recognize the symptoms. We can grow it in culture and then do DNA sequencing to identify the species. The one in the video is Phytophthora ramorum that I showed you the damage from in the very first slide, the sudden oak death pathogen. We don't have that in our forests here. It's more of a nursery issue, but in California and Southern Oregon, it's taking out tan oak, certain oak species down there. So it's a real problem, but our forests are very different up here. Okay, let's look. So the symptoms of Phytophthora that we'll likely see are caused by Phytophthora root disease. And so the tree will, or, it can happen on like herbaceous or woody shrubs too, but the plant will start wilting. If it's become severe, you'll see sudden wilting and yellowing of the foliage, a more chronic infection as it's attacking the fine roots. You might see the foliage becoming smaller in size and the canopy thinning, as you can see in this photo of the trees here. If you look closer at the base of the tree, if the disease has moved from the fine roots up into the stem, there will be a very black canker at the base extending up from the soil line as on the madrone, or more of a bleeding type of canker that you can see on the alder tree here. But if it's coming from the soil and the root system, it'll extend up from the base of the tree and move up and eventually girdle the tree. But that happens in the later stages. So here's an example of one that we're concerned about. It's Phytophthora alnii, and it kills various alder species. It's killing a lot of alders in Europe. I believe this disease originated in the UK. It's a hybrid of two other Phytophthora species that probably came together in a nursery and formed this hybrid that's very aggressive on alder. We don't have Phytophthora alnii in the US, but we have Phytophthora alnii uniformis. This hybrid has kind of broken into 3 subspecies. And the uniformis one has been found in Alaska, in Oregon, and I found it in nurseries here. It can cause symptoms on alder, but it's not as aggressive as the alnii subspecies that they have in Europe. But we're still watching for this one. And you can see the dead trees on the along the river, the kind of crown dieback with alder. So that's something that, if you see that, you want to look a little more closely and look for the bleeding cankers on the stem. There are other Phytophthora species that will cause the same symptom on alder, but they're endemic. So, it takes taking samples and bringing it to the lab to identify what species is actually out there. Another one we're concerned about is Phytophthora cinnamomi. And this is a photo in California of it wiping out some native manzanita that are rare and endangered. And this is in a very dry environment in California. We've found cinnamomi in nurseries here. It likes warmer soil conditions. We've also found it in Oregon on Christmas trees just this past year. So it's kind of an interesting thing. As the soils get warmer with climate change, we might be seeing more and more of this organism. We would normally think, oh, it can't survive. You know, we haven't found it in our forest because our soils are too cold, but that could be changing. And the organism can also be adapting to our cooler soils as well. But it's extremely aggressive and extremely damaging, and it has a lot of hosts. So, and it's been around for a long time, you know, and invaded in many different areas in the world. And so here is an example of the host range of some of these organisms. The ones with a star are invasive in the Western US. So you see Phytophthora lateralis that causes Port Orford cedar root disease only has 109 records in the database, and it has only maybe 3 hosts. Whereas, you know, cinnamomi has, you know, upwards of 1,700 records on different hosts and locations. So it's all over the place. It has a lot of hosts. Some of these others, such as Cryptogaea, megasperma, are very common in nurseries. They can cause damage just like cinnamomi and these others can too, but they're not invasive. Excuse me. Okay, so the way it moves around, it can move from a nursery where it's sitting in, you know, you have like larger size container plants, like a, you know, upwards from a gallon that have been sitting there for a long time, and they can pick up diseases from the soil, especially if they're sitting on the soil surface and there's flooding, and the Phytophthora can swim and move around between pots like that. It can move into wildlands. We don't really think it moves from wildlands to nurseries. I haven't really seen much evidence of that. And it can also move into restoration sites from a nursery and then into a wildland. So these are ways that Phytophthora and other diseases can move.
You have about 3 minutes left, Marianne.
Oh, okay. Yeah, and so Phytophthora, yeah, like I said, it needs water. So you can look for symptoms, you know, in areas that flood, because water moves downhill at the bottom of a slope. This is a nursery where you can see horsetail. That's indicative of wet soil. So that's where to look for it. Like I said, it spreads in nursery plants. The spores can infest the soil and then spread through the water. We did a study a few years ago. We bought nursery plants, gallon-sized plants from different native plant nurseries, and sampled for Phytophthora, and 25% of the plants had at least one Phytophthora, which was really more than I thought we would find. So it can be there and not cause symptoms and just nibble away on the fine roots for a long time so it's very difficult to deal with. So the best way to keep it out is to, you know, prevent infection from happening in the first place. So here's a list of ways to do that. I have more information about how a person could go about preventing Phytophthora if you have a nursery or you're growing for restoration. And in particular, we have this publication that came out with Oregon State, preventing Phytophthora infestations in restoration nursery. They're available online, or if you want a paper copy, you can email me and I can send you a physical copy of this. And we also have a website. And here are some links to various things that might be helpful, such as the publication I mentioned. This group, Phytosphere in California, has a lot of really good information about best management practices and other information about Phytophthora and restoration sites. And then here's a document from the Forest Service about white pine blister rust. So all of these are good links to if you want to learn more about this stuff. So I think that's all. We can take questions or whatever. I'm going to stop sharing.
Okay. Thank you, Marianne.